Hi, I'm Ellie Anderson.
And I'm David Peña-Guzmán.
And we are the co-hosts of Overthink podcast and YouTube channel. We are going to be talking today about, David, your book, When Animals Dream, engaging in a conversation about it. I will say we actually did a series on animals a couple of years ago. We have an animal personhood, animal consciousness, and one on animal ethics. What do we call it?
Oh my goodness. Animal sociality, maybe? I don't recall.
Oh my god. Okay,
Animal justice. We also have an episode called Animal Justice in
with
which we
Martha Nussbaum.
interview Martha Nussbaum.
Yeah, so we have a number of animal episodes on our podcast. Animal episode sounds weird, but you know what I mean. Episodes focusing on philosophy and animals. But we're going to be talking about, your book specifically today, David, When Animals Dream, The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness. It's funny seeing the paperback because I have the hardback, but it's at my office. So you brought the paperback for us today. And this came out 2022, I was going to say.
Yes.
Our podcast episodes are from 2022. But anyway, we just wanted to kind of introduce some core ideas, not presuming any background knowledge of the topic. So if you're interested in knowing about animal consciousness, this is for you. It's not just like a promo of your book. It's a substantive conversation on the basis of it with you as an expert. So, David, I'm just going to play the role here of somebody who hasn't read the book and doesn't know a lot about the topic, which is convenient because it's been almost 2 years since I read the book and I have a really bad memory. So, David, tell us about animal consciousness. Let's say somebody thinks that to be conscious is a property of humans. And they think that animals, are sentient. They're obviously living beings, but they don't have consciousness. This is not only a view that you find a lot throughout the history of philosophy, including in Descartes' idea that animals are just machines, but it's also something you see in more recent philosophy too. Heidegger famously says that animals are poor in world. And although that's not quite the same as saying that they don't have consciousness, I do think, especially for those who might define consciousness as reflective self-awareness, it's easy to say that either animals, and I mean non-human animals, don't have consciousness, or that if they do have consciousness, we don't know this and we could never know it unless they had linguistic capacities.
Yeah, so as a number of people have pointed out who specialize in animal philosophy, a lot of the debate often hinges around definitions of the term consciousness. It's one of these very slippery terms where some people mean one thing by it, other people mean another. And so often I find myself in a position of having to ask for clarification about what we mean by consciousness itself. Because even in the way in which you framed the question, Ellie, you said, a lot of people might agree that animals are sentient, but that they don't quite have consciousness. And even the difference between sentience and consciousness is highly contested because it's unclear that you can be a sentient being, presumably sentience here referring to the capacity to experience positive and negative emotional states, pain and pleasure, for example. It's unclear that you can have that without being already conscious, without that already being a form of consciousness. But you're right that typically when people use the term consciousness, they refer to something much more cognitive rather than affective. By that, usually it means the mastery and use of language. It can mean the use of tools. And, Heidegger's argument that animals are poor in world falls somewhere in between those two, where it's about language and it's about tool use as well. And so the way in which I think about consciousness, just to put my cards on the table here, because
you've developed an entire theory, so please put your cards on the table.
Yeah, and so I move away from the cognitive camp, from people who think that consciousness requires the performance of high-end cognitive operations like language, like concept manipulation, like abstraction. I do think that those are evidence of consciousness, but I don't think that they are necessary preconditions for consciousness. And even when we think about our own life, about human experience, there are dimensions of our experience of the world and our experience of sensibility that happen and that unfold one step below the level of objectification and abstraction and conceptuality below the layer, one layer below language, let's say. And so this is where you see my own training in phenomenology sort of coming to the aid in my thinking about animals, because that's something that a lot of phenomenologists have tried to expose, right? That there is this tie, this bond, this primordial connection we have to the world that doesn't require the introduction of cognition, and that nonetheless gives us a meaningful grasp on reality.
Okay.
And so I begin from this assumption, and I found that that's very helpful for dealing with other species, precisely because of the problem of language, right? That they can communicate with us and they don't have what we call a language.
Yeah. And I'm just kind of curious too what you think in general about this idea of consciousness as involving a sort of reflexivity or reflection, in part because this is something that comes up in some of my work on self-awareness. A lot of people define self-awareness or self-consciousness, even if it's pre-reflective or pre-linguistic, as some form of turning back on oneself, as some form of reflexivity. And you see this in some phenomenologists in the term auto-affection, the idea that consciousness is sort of touching itself or affecting itself, even though that doesn't need to be reflective. It also comes up in a lot of reflective accounts too, where people will say self-consciousness is the capacity to distance yourself from a kind of primary level of mental states, right? And reflect on those, and that's actually consciousness. Some will say that's self-consciousness, but some people actually will say no, that distinction between the two levels is necessary for consciousness itself. So I'm curious, like, what you think about this sort of reflexive model, whether it's like in the more traditionally reflective terms or not.
So it depends on where we place the self-reflection and the reflexivity, where we locate it. Because most people place it in the mind, right? So we become conscious when our thinking folds back upon itself, and I can have thoughts about my thoughts. So like right now I'm really stressed out about these questions that Ellie is asking me. That's a reflective maneuver, and so it would show that I am conscious because I take my own intentional life as an object of my intentionality. And this is how a lot of philosophers talk about it, right? That in order for a non-human animal to show consciousnness, they have to show this signs of this auto-affectation at the level of the intellect, which is sometimes called metacognition. And there is research that some animals do succeed in that regard. Not a lot, but usually here we're talking about the quote-unquote highly cerebralized animals, like non-human primates, chimpanzees, bonobos, elephants.
The mirror test, right?
The mirror test, where there's literally a kind of reflexive and reflective. But there's also a way of cashing out the problem of reflexivity that locates it not in the mind, but in the body. Where, think about simply an animal's understanding of the boundaries of their own body. If I, as an animal, for instance, I have multiple limbs, and sometimes I need to interact with the world, and I don't get confused about what is an external object and what is part of my body. Right? And so there is already in my ability to distinguish self and other at the level of action on a very practical, embodied level, there's already a kind of reflexivity, because it means that my body touches itself and can recognize when it is touching itself as opposed to when it is being touched by a foreign body. Kinesthesia or proprioception, those kinds of inner senses. I know inner is maybe not the right word for it here, but that's how they describe. Fine. And so that is something that we know a lot of animals can do, and that animals have been able to do since the Cambrian explosion about 400 million years ago. As animals that are as quote unquote simple as crustaceans. So we know that shrimp from the Cambrian explosion, again, who have a lot of limbs, can tell the difference. They don't get confused, and they don't accidentally grab one of their limbs and try to eat it. They attack other animals and eat them. And so they do have a self-other judgment that happens at the level of bodily or operative intentionality. And so if we corporealize that reflexivity, then a lot of animals suddenly seem to have it, now that it's kind of liberated from this more cognitive interpretation. Be that as it may, to finally get to your question.
No, it's great. You've been getting there.
Yeah. So I do really like that approach. I like the embodiment of reflexivity.
Yeah.
But I also believe that consciousness appears as soon as appearance appears.
Okay.
In the history of life.
Okay.
So whenever you have an organism for whom something manifests, I'll say subject, even though that's also a contested term.
I'm fine with that term. Yeah. I'm reclaiming that term, but wanting to redefine it in some stuff I'm working on now. So
then in
maybe it'll be out by the time you watch this video.
In connection to shrimp, also.
Your book is When Animals Dream. My book is like When Shrimp Are Subjects.
Yes. And so whenever you have an organism that has the kind of body and mind that allows it to sense something, something appears for it, that lighting up of a world, and I use a lot of metaphors of light and illumination in the first part of the book. For me, that's already a kind of experience that is indicative of consciousness.
Okay.
And so if you imagine even the most simple imaginable kind of creature, like a very simple organism that only registers a gradient of light, from light to dark, that organism is already conscious of that gradient and acts in relation to it, preferring more or less light.
Okay.
And even if that organism doesn't quite yet have that embodied operational intentionality of self and other, even if it doesn't yet have that complex mind that can think thoughts about its own thinking, I would say that organism is conscious, and that is a very vast conception of consciousness that I work with.
Yeah.
That finds it spread throughout the animal kingdom.
So does that mean that every organism is conscious, on your view?
So that I'm not willing to say that. Well, definitely not every organism, because plants are organisms, and on my view, they wouldn't be conscious in this way.
Yeah.
And so I do, although I remain open to changing my view about this, I do want to keep a distinction in place between the vegetable and the animal. Again, maybe open to revision depending on where the science and the philosophy take us.
Yeah.
But you also do get some gray areas when you start talking about amoeba.
Yeah.
When you start talking about bacteria. When you start talking, about unicellular organisms.
Okay.
And so I don't want to worry too much about those hard cases yet. I think they deserve treatment on their own.
Yeah.
But by and large, I do think virtually all animals are conscious.
Okay. Now, the title of your book is When Animals Dream, and you're making a case about the dreaming consciousness of animals. So tell us about that. Like, where do dreams fit in here?
So dreams became my window into debates about consciousness. Because, of course, when you talk about consciousness, you need to figure out what sorts of behaviors and comportments are evidence of that, right? So, for example, if an animal figures out its way through a maze, is that evidence of consciousness? Or if an animal empathically bonds with another animal and cares for another animal, is that evidence of consciousness? And there are a lot of people in ethology, in evolutionary theory, in animal welfare, that try to talk about the many ways in which we know that animals are conscious. And in doing research and in just sort of being familiar with the field of animal studies, I came to the realization that, for a good reason, most discussions about animal consciousness look at what animals do when they're awake. And there are good reasons for that, because animals are active, they're engaged with the world when they're not sleeping. But then I thought to myself, well, could it be that when they are asleep, we also see signs of consciousness? And so that took me in the direction of animal sleep research, and ultimately into this topic about dreams, whether or not animals dream. And then as a corollary of that, or as a secondary question, if they do dream, what implications we can draw
Yeah.
about the kinds of minds that they have on the basis of that fact.
Okay.
So it became my entry point, and it just happened to be, I happened to be lucky that nobody had really written about this in a substantive way. So it is the first book on the subject, and I've been pretty happy with what it allowed me to do in relation to the subject. Yeah.
Okay. And I will say, I mean, I know we were like, this isn't just like a plug for the book, this is a substantive conversation, but it's a super readable book. And I think you know, there are fun illustrations. There's like a lot of anecdotes and stuff. So I think it is accessible in that way too. I mean, you've described it as a kind of crossover academic, but also book for a more public audience, and I think that speaks to you know, just like its kind of readability, even if you're not an expert in the field, although as you said it is like making a contribution. I want to make sure it's not going to fall over. We're good. So I want to ask just a couple of quick questions as we approach the end of this, broadening out from the book, and say, as an expert in this subject, have there been any moments for you, you know, somewhat recently, in like the past year or two since you wrote the book, where you're like, oh my God, that finding is so cool and interesting? Like any studies that have emerged have just kind of blown your mind, or new ideas that have come to the fore?
Oh, so new ideas that have come out since the book was published?
Yeah, but if there aren't any, we could also talk before.
There are. So I've actually been surprised by this, because when I was doing the research, I really was struggling to find sources and material that is relevant. I mean, I was looking for dissertations and master's theses from the 80s and 90s that only existed in paper form at various universities, you know, enlisting the help of librarians, etc. And so there was a certain scarcity of sources. Yeah. And I talk about that in the book. The fact that it is a neglected subject, and it shouldn't be, because dreams are so fascinating. Yeah. And the fact that other animals dream should be front and center in our discussion of consciousness, because dreams, think about what they are. They are this kind of magical creation of the mind under the most radical conditions imaginable, which are the conditions of sleep, when you're disconnected. When
you don't have any external stimuli, let's say. Yeah.
And so it's the mind being conscious on its own terms.
Yeah.
And sort of stimulating itself into producing that world that appears. Yeah. Anyway, so
because you're not having no external stimuli. Now I'm like in my head about that claim I just made.
But
it's
mostly
different.
Not, yes.
You know, not like sight. Not one's based on sight. You know, and
and I mean, there's a shutting down. It's not complete.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to slightly clarify so that people in the comments aren't like, there are still external stimuli. Okay.
Yes.
Anyway.
And so wait, what was the question? Oh,
the question was
Yes. And
there's something that's blown your mind.
So initially I was struggling to find stuff. Yeah. Since the book has come out, there have been a number of things that I just made me think, oh my God, is this currently a wave of interest in the subject matter that my book just happened to sort of ride? I don't want to say produce, because that's not true, but it's happening at the same time. So the two or maybe three things that I will mention, one is that since the book was published, there's been some research out of Germany suggesting that spiders, some species of spiders, especially jumping spiders, have what we could call the capacity to dream. They show some interesting activity during their version of REM. And so that brings to the table an entirely new class of animals, arthropods, that for a long time have not been part of the discussion of consciousness, period.
Okay.
And especially dreaming.
Interesting.
And so this is, a new taxonomic classification entering the discussion. There has also been, I've been told that there are some people, the research is not out yet, so I'll have to wait and see, who are beginning to work on worm dreams. Now, so here we're talking about, animals that maybe we wouldn't quite think of as dreamers.
What's a worm? Worm dreams.
Yeah, worm dreams. Not temperature-wise.
You fully said warm dreams. I was like, what is a warm dream?
Yeah, earthworms.
The dreams you have when you're on vacation in a tropical location. Okay.
It's not too hot, it's not too cold. No, but so with these animals, thinking about residual nerve activity that happens during periods of sleep, and what that represents, and whether it is a rudimentary version of dreaming. The fact that the nervous system is still firing when the animal has cut connection to the external world. The last thing is I recently...
I asked for one, now you're telling me three.
I said two or three.
This is the most David thing ever. You ask for one example, he gives you two or three. Okay, we're so different.
Yes. So the third one, only because this is very recent, in the book I talk a lot about birds, and evidence that they do have these sonoric dreams where they dream about their songs.
Yeah, the finch you talk about.
The finch, yes. And... recently, there was a study published that I was asked to comment on for a newspaper article. So I went and read the piece, and we are learning more about birds. And it suggests that the research now suggests that not only are they dreaming about their songs, they're also dreaming of the sounds they make when they defend their territory. So they dream of having these antagonistic social interactions where they're trying to keep others at bay, which makes it way more dynamic. Because
don't make enemies with a bird because they will dream about you.
They hold a grudge. So yeah, there is interesting stuff that couldn't make it onto the book because it didn't exist yet.
Yeah. Okay. So quick and final question. You get one. You do not get two or three. Favorite animal and why?
Well, I mean... I have a fascination with octopuses. And I think they're very interesting. And their embodiment and their cognition and their consciousness challenges a lot of our assumptions about what embodiment, cognition, and consciousness ought to look like. And so I think by thinking about cephalopods, in particular octopuses, we can more easily come to appreciate the radical diversity of forms of life and forms of sentience that exist in nature. And the book begins with a story about a particular octopus. And so I would say that that's my favorite.
You're joining the robust octopus literature.
Yes.
People love octopuses. Well, thank you, David, for sharing these awesome insights. It's so fun to have this conversation and also to see what different directions it took based on, relative to some of the other conversations we've had about this, both in public and in private. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're like a co-host of this channel, but I'm interviewing you. If you haven't already liked and subscribed our channel, but you enjoyed this conversation, please consider doing so. We also have our audio podcast, which you can find on all platforms. And we have a Patreon where we have Zoom meetings and other sort of bonus ways to get involved if you want to support the work that we do here. Thank you so much.
Bye.